Anyway, colleagues, so today, a very special topic. Every time in this course is a very special topic. Today we talk about Aristotle. Now, let me start somewhere, okay? So, I mentioned in the seminars today that Greeks are not rocket science. Greeks are harder than rocket science, and I can tell you this authoritatively as a among other things I teach, among the courses that I teach, there's a course in philosophy of science. So I understand something about that, about the nature of complexity. There's an objective measure by which philosophy and social theory is apparently more complex than the natural sciences. So I mean this very seriously. And the immediate reason for me to mention this is because I want to warn everybody, right? We begin with the most difficult classes. Plato and Aristotle are going to be much more difficult than everything else that's going to follow, especially Plato. The immediate reason for this is because the context is just so different. We have different assumptions about religion, about politics, different assumptions about the world. But then, of course, for Plato, you have these dialogues within dialogues. There's a dialogue which Plato retells, but there's also a dialogue which goes on between Plato and the reader. And, Plato's inserting kinds of allusions, double meanings that are most often not evident first time you read them. So anyway, let me try to bring this, sort of maybe restart this conversation, bring this back to the course in general, right? So a very important topic, maybe for the course as a whole, but especially for these first classes, is this question of what is justice? What is justice? Is justice a conventional myth? People like Thrasymachus or Callicles would say this, or people like Protagoras. For Thrasymachus and Callicles, this would be a detrimental, a vicious lie. Well, I don't want to say vicious, but it's a sinister lie that masks the interests of the rulers. Protagoras says it is a necessary conventional myth. But Homer, Socrates, Plato, always with a question mark because of the dialogical nature. Homer, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would say, no, justice is objective and universal. So it's kind of a rundown. So maybe let's separate this out. So we begin with Homer, who says that justice is the divine law decreed and enforced by Zeus, right? This is the traditional vision of justice. Again, for the Greeks, this would be associated with the Olympian gods, but you can think of other religions as well if you want. And this is the traditional view of justice, the unreflective view of justice, that if you want, the irrational view of justice, that we are simply supposed to follow the laws and customs of our society. So Thrasymachus or Callicles would say that justice is a lie told by the rulers, or for Callicles, by the weak, to serve their own interests. And this is a position that we should keep in mind. And this, on the one hand, this seems to be an antisocial and potentially dangerous position. But on the other hand, this is a very important position in terms of social criticism and in terms of possibility of progress or possibility of reform. If we do not already live in a perfect society, right, social criticism may play a very important part. So people like Thrasymachus and Callicles may be socially useful, extremely socially useful. We'll talk later about philosopher John Stuart Mill, who would very much invite people like Callicles and Thrasymachus to participate in the public dialogue, and sort of to keep us on our toes, to keep us on the lookout for potential, injustice or problems with our social system. But Protagoras, or this sophistic interpretation of Plato, when I say sophistic interpretation of Plato, I mean Protagorean interpretation of Plato, right? Justice is a necessary myth. It is a noble lie which prevents social chaos. So these are the positions we have discussed already. Again, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, difficult to summarize. We'd need more classes, but in some broad outlines. So it seems that there's a difference between early Socratic dialogues and what Plato writes in the Republic. So for Socrates, again, justice is based on objective and universal standard of human excellence, discoverable through philosophical reflection, available to everybody. Again, it seems that Socrates, walked the streets of Athens. He would talk to anybody whatsoever. So, and this would be a big difference between what Socrates says and what Plato says in the Republic, right? Because in the Republic, again, we are talking about the objective and universal form of justice, and the world of forms can be discovered through long years of mathematical and philosophical study. In fact, Plato insists that you have to go through 10 years of mathematics and then 5 years of dialectics, by which he means philosophy on top of that. But again, very importantly, 10 years of mathematics. We tend to not think of political philosophy, or in general statecraft, the science of politics. We tend to not think about it as dependent on mathematics to such an extent. But again, it seems there's a difference, and the difference is that for Socrates, again, this virtue through philosophical reflection should be available to everybody. But again, in Republic, if we consider that to be a middle dialogue, it seems that Plato changes this Socratic position and says only the elite, only the rulers who are dominated by this passionate desire for knowledge, only they will be able to live a full human existence and achieve ultimate human excellence, whereas the soldiers and the craftsmen are going to have to make do with obeying the wise rulers, so to speak. And this is a problem, and I think an important difference between Socrates and Plato. But Aristotle is going to emphasize against Plato that justice depends on circumstances, and he would very much argue against this sort of universal standards of justice. Justice depends on the circumstances. Some places are going to be democracies, some places are going to be oligarchies or aristocracies. We're going to talk about this in a second. And a good citizen of a aristocracy could be different from a good citizen of a monarchy, right? And very importantly, Aristotle is going to emphasize this idea of practical wisdom, phronesis, or phronesis. And practical wisdom is acquired through long years of engaging in practice of politics. Again, under ideal circumstances, taking turns, ruling and being ruled. Again, so compare that to Plato's vision of 10 years of mathematics, right? And Aristotle's idea, no, you have to engage in politics. This is on the outset. This is on the outset. Okay, so let me. This is sort of the broad outline. Let me now, in some sense, maybe go closer to Aristotle. Although we will be returning back to Plato from time to time. So I remind you, Plato does not write treatises. Plato writes dialogues. So it's very hard to know exactly what Plato means. And his thought seems to be evolving. But Aristotle does write treatises. So I think it's much easier for us to understand what he's talking about, right? So a couple of things for fun about Aristotle. His school was known as the Peripatetics because Aristotle liked to philosophize while he was walking. And I can very much relate to that. I think it's, I cannot give a lecture sitting down, philosophical reflection requires physical activity, I think. Anyway, Heidegger gives us a wonderful summary of Aristotle's life. He was born, he philosophized, and he died. So this is what we should talk about, right, in our presentations. So Aristotle was also was obviously influenced a lot by Plato, and on the one hand, there's this contrast between Plato and Aristotle. There's this very famous fresco by Raphael about the school of Athens, where Aristotle, I should have included this in the slides, where Aristotle is pointing down to earth and Plato is pointing up at the sky. And on the one hand, people like to contrast Plato and Aristotle, saying that, oh, they have completely opposite worldviews, but that's actually not exactly true. I'm not sure how much time we're going to have for this, but within the Neoplatonic synthesis, actually Plato and Aristotle are synthesized. And in fact, if you compare Plato and Aristotle to Epicurus, or to Thomas Hobbes, let's say, it seems that Plato and Aristotle are actually, very close, almost identical. There's an interesting relationship always with a question mark between Aristotle and Alexander the Great, probably entirely mythical, as far as serious historians can tell. Aristotle had absolutely no influence on Alexander's development, although people like to fantasize about that. But I thought I'd give this out. So also sort of couple miscellaneous facts. According to tradition, according to historical reconstruction, Aristotle actually also wrote dialogues, and almost all of them are lost, which is deeply unfortunate. And what we have instead are what seems to be lecture notes, and it's unclear whether it's his own lecture notes that he prepared for his lectures, or maybe this is the lecture notes that his students took. But either way, Aristotle's writing is horrifying. It's very difficult to read, and because these are lecture notes, sometimes they, a paragraph would break in mid-sentence, so it's kind of slightly disorganized. In general, I'm going to talk about this more in a second, but well, actually, maybe let me talk about this. So, if we want to contrast Plato and Aristotle, again, we should not push the contrast too far because there are differences, but there are also similarities. So we can think of Plato as a mathematician and Aristotle as a biologist. Aristotle actually did engage in biological studies, so he dissected fishes, for example, and classified their organs. And Aristotle's father, according to tradition, was actually a doctor, so Aristotle has this affinity. And you see, it's kind of, I think you can see, the metaphor of the mathematician and of biologist, and again, the way it bears on their political reflections. Again, for Plato, the way you do political philosophy, especially in the Republic, because Plato is going to modify his philosophy later in life. But in the Republic for Plato, it seems, again, the way he portrays Socrates, what you do is like a mathematician, you close your eyes and you perform a thought experiment. You forget about the world. This world is full of change and decay and corruption, and Plato, in this revolutionary way, reactionary but also revolutionary way, would say that all cities are bad. All countries are bad, or almost all countries are bad. Nothing is worth salvaging, right? So he wants to close his eyes and start from scratch and imagine a perfect city in his mind. This is what Plato does. And this is very much if you want a mathematical method. Like if Jupiter forbid, something horrible happens to you and you end up in an accident completely paralyzed, presumably you can still do mathematics in your head. So, right, with all of your senses cut off, right? But Aristotle has a very different approach, So, for Aristotle, you cannot do biology with your eyes closed. You cannot do biology through thought experiments. You have to open your eyes and go into the world. And so, whereas Plato constructs this city in speech, Callipolis is a thought experiment, radically different from all existing regimes. And notice, Plato says that in order to implement the Callipolis, in order to realize it in reality, you take children below the age of 10. And this is how you start a city, which was, by the way, not a completely outrageous proposition, because ancient Greeks actually sent out colonies. There was a practice of establishing colonies. So it's extravagant. I'm not sure if anybody ever tried it. It would be difficult, obviously. But it was not an unthinkable proposition to take a bunch of children below the age of 10 and under the supervision of a few wise men go and try to establish a colony somewhere in some empty place, place which is not occupied, right? Well, anyway. So this is Plato, but Aristotle, his approach as a biologist, essentially, again, is to go out into the world and to observe. And so what Aristotle's approach to politics is going to begin not by closing our eyes and imagining a perfect city, but Aristotle's approach is going to be to open our eyes, to go out into the world, to actually look at the existing constitutions, look at them, study them, and then to try to construct a classification, to rank the cities, which are better, which are worse. And if at the end of the day you find a certain ideal, you take a cue, you take this ideal, you derive this ideal from actually existing states. This is the crucial difference between Plato and Aristotle. Again, Plato wants a standard outside of the existing societies, and he wants to take the standard and judge by this external standard, judge existing regimes. And he finds very, very little of value in existing regimes. And again, it seems that a Socratic solution would be that if you are born in a bad state, well, the only thing you can do is live a private life. Again, it seems that for Plato and Socrates, that if you are unlucky enough to be born in a bad state, which is what most people have to deal with, right? Your only solution is to just if you are lucky enough that you can somehow start doing philosophy, right? who taught philosophy to Socrates? And it's hard to say. Maybe he had some kind of inborn talent, right? But what you do is you live as a private citizen, it's very much an anti-political solution to politics, to the problem of politics, and radically individualistic anti-political solution to the problem of politics. But again, so this is Plato, and he thinks about an external standard, whereas for Aristotle, no, we need an internal standard, internal to the cities. You look at the cities and you try to derive a standard of what is a good city by looking at them. So it's like, again, imagine you're a doctor. You don't. Plato would close his eyes and try to imagine what a perfect human being looks like. Somehow, through some kind of mathematical abstraction, which is why, again, in terms of this rationalism, empiricism, Plato is often, sort of classified on the rationalist side, and always with a question mark, and Aristotle would be classified more on the empiricist side. Although we have to keep in mind that sort of these words are not not necessarily well defined, in respect to ancient Greek philosophers, because these are going to be later movements in philosophy. Anyway, so as long as we're careful with these words, it's fine to use them. So Aristotle, like a doctor, would look at many different patients. He would look at 100 patients and notice nobody is perfectly healthy. That's the point about human beings. I mean, in general, this is the world we live in. No single individual is perfectly healthy. But a doctor, by looking at all the different individuals who are, unhealthy to varying degrees, can form an image of perfect health. And this is going to be the difference. But also the doctor will be realistic. The doctor would understand that nobody can be perfectly healthy. So you can have this image of perfect health, and it has some use, but in general, you have to be a realist. You have to expect a certain, if you want, realistic standard of what is humanly achievable in terms of health. Anyway, so let me move on. Okay, so this is same thing but in different guys. I wonder which one looks better. Anyway, so and yes, I'm going to talk about this later, but let me immediately stress this. So for Aristotle, politics is valuable in itself, and we're going to talk about this, in terms of the Republican tradition, that there's value in taking turns ruling and being ruled under ideal circumstances for Aristotle. And Plato, no, Plato doesn't want politics. He doesn't want this engagement. All he wants, it seems, in the Republic is rational administration. And remember that the guardians, the true guardians, who are the philosopher kings, right? The philosopher kings do not want to rule. They are driven, for Plato, the rulers are driven by passion for knowledge. They're driven by passion for knowledge, and it's just that you cannot do philosophy if you live in the woods. You need to live in a city which provides for your needs, and so you would prefer to engage in philosophy all the time, but that's impossible, and so you have to force yourself. The philosopher king or queen would have to force him or herself to go down back into the cave and to rule these stupid people, because this is a necessity. And I've actually written this in the previous slide. This is very important. For Plato, politics is a necessary evil. Politics is a necessary evil. Like in general, ideally, you would prefer to never engage in politics. Whereas for Aristotle, no. Engaging in politics is integral to human excellence and to human happiness. If you want to be properly human and properly happy as a human being, you have to take part in politics. Okay. So where do we go? Okay, and I've already mentioned this, right? So Plato is a revolutionary, extreme revolutionary, especially in the Republic, and Aristotle is a conservative. So let's talk about conservatism. So the ultimate statement of conservatism for a course like this should come from Hegel. And Hegel has this wonderful phrase: "Was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, und was wirklich ist, das ist vernünftig." What is real is rational. What is rational is real. So It's a long potential discussion of the theory of forms and the difference between Plato and Aristotle, and maybe I'll come back to this in a later slide. But the basic idea is that for both Plato and Aristotle, this world is a, it is a deeply rational place in the sense that both Plato and Aristotle have a theory of forms, right? But for Plato, forms exist independently of the world. They exist, if you want, above the world. And so, if we believe the dialogues in which he argues for the immortality of the soul, the ultimate goal in life for Plato is to die. And, to die in a properly prepared way. Again, it's a complicated story, but especially within the Neoplatonic synthesis, the idea would be that if you engage in the life of philosophy and then you die, you get to contemplate. Contemplate means think about, right? You get to think about the forms for the rest of eternity, and this is the highest blessing for a human being, according to Plato, right? So this is philosophy's preparation for death. In this sense. But if you led the life of vice, which would be engaging especially in the pleasures of the body, then your soul will be drawn down to this world of change and decay, and you will be reborn again, and will be forced to suffer through another life and another life, something like that. So even though, again, both Plato and Aristotle have this vision of the forms, for Plato, the forms are separate. The forms are separate. And this world, insofar as it is below the forms, it is kind of bad. Because what is really good about this world is actually above the world, is divorced from the world. Now, Aristotle has a completely different picture. For Aristotle, forms are embodied in the world. This is called hylomorphism. So the unity, so hylomorphism literally means the unity of form and matter. So again, forms are instantiated in the world for Aristotle. And so this world is good, and this world, in an important sense, is all there is for us. So Plato has an argument for the immortality of the soul. Again, Plato, you understand, Plato is a skeptic. He writes dialogues. Does he actually believe that? That's a separate question. But certainly Plato presents arguments why the soul is immortal. But Aristotle, it seems, Aristotle believes that the soul is not immortal. In fact, for Aristotle, the soul seems to be the organizing principle of the body. The soul is like a harmony of the body. So if you imagine a musical instrument, so as long as the musical instrument is well attuned and is able to play, right? You could say, metaphorically speaking, that the instrument is alive. But once if you break the instrument, if it goes out of tune, right? In some metaphorical sense, it dies. So it's like Plato would say that your body dies and your soul leaves it, right? But Aristotle would say it is because the soul is destroyed, the body dies. And the soul, it seems, because Aristotle, again, you have to understand his exoteric writings, his dialogues are lost, we have to go on his lecture notes. And as far as we can tell from his lecture notes, Aristotle actually believed that death is the end. Death is the end. And so the proper human life, the proper human excellence has to be realized in this life. He would have none of this Platonic stuff about realizing your excellence and becoming happy after you die. No, this life, here and now, is where you have to become happy and have to become fulfilled. Right? And there is a possibility that there's a part of the human soul which survives the death of the body, but this part may be impersonal. So it's a complicated story, but let me just mention this in 1 second. So most of medieval theologians in Jewish, Islamic, and Christian traditions were actually engaged very much with Plato and Aristotle, and basically they read the Torah or the Quran or the Christian New Testament through the lens of Plato and Aristotle. And theologians, Jewish, Islamic, and Christian theologians in the Middle Ages would have these debates whether the soul survives the death of the body, right? And Platonism had this substantiation sort of the idea that your soul somehow lives, but some philosophers, I think, wonderful Islamic philosopher, Ibn Rushd, my favorite Islamic philosopher, I think as far as I understand, he believed that no, actually, the Quran has to be read metaphorically, and the divine intellect, which is in us, survives our death, but it has nothing to do with our personality. Everything that makes us us, our own personal experience, that just dies. And it's like this divine intellect. It's like if you imagine your computer and you have a cloud server, right? So whenever you engage in some rational calculation, it's as if your local machine, your local computer, your body accesses this data somewhere on the cloud server. And the cloud server survives the death, but the cloud server was not you. And it's like, so it's like the idea being that for Aristotelians, the intellect being common to all. And the reason why 2 + 2 is equal to 4 for me and 2 + 2 is equal to 4 for you is that when we engage in mathematics, it's strictly speaking not us engaging in mathematics, but we access the same cloud server, which is called this divine intellect. Nous in Greek. Anyway, I'm not sure. But again. You see, but precisely for this reason that Aristotle seems to not believe that the soul survives, that you as a person, like he doesn't seem to believe in afterlife. That's why he's going to be very much interested in this life. And so, and this is why politics is going to be important. So we're going to talk about this. Also, it's a complicated story, but I have to tell you, just at least in one sentence. Again, in the Middle Ages, especially Plato's Republic, with this vision of philosopher kings, had a lot of appeal to religious philosophers, to theologians, and again, especially interpreting Plato's Republic as ruled by saints. For example, some Islamic commentators try to interpret Plato precisely in this way, would be very much interested, would see Mohammed as the ultimate philosopher king who has access to somehow eternal and universal truth, and therefore organize the state in this accordance. So again, it's a long separate discussion, but I just want you to be aware of this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Aristotle in a second. Actually, maybe let me start with this and then I'll talk about that. So, I mean, these two slides I want to talk about at the same time. So, what defines Aristotle is this phrase, zoon politikon, which can be translated as man is by nature a political animal. Or if you want, social and political animal, because polis in ancient Greek kind of means both political association and society. So man is by nature a political animal, or man is by nature a social and political animal. And Aristotle is going to talk about this, how by nature we have a capacity for speech, and speech is this public act, logos. And also, very interestingly, if you talk about this physis and nomos, for Aristotle, see, by physis, by nature, we are a nomos-making animal. So our nomoi, our laws, our conventions, are actually made in accordance with physis in some deep respect. But sort of the ultimate upshot of this phrase, zoon politikon, and this is maybe going to be the central idea, the most important idea of today's lecture, is that human beings can properly flourish only in a society, or actually, I should correct that, only in a well-constituted society, because there's a difference, and this is something that we have to keep in mind. So anyway, so yeah, I should mention that for both Plato and Aristotle, there's this important connection. I mean, in the broadest sense, the most important task of politics, the most important task of communal life, is the proper education of citizens. That's sort of the task of the polis is to produce excellent individuals, or if you want, virtuous polis produces virtuous citizens, right? And this is very different. This is the ancient outlook. This is going to be very different from the outlook that we get after the scientific revolution, especially with philosophers like Machiavelli or Hobbes, who are going to say, no, human beings are by nature bad, and the task of politics is not to produce virtue, but the task of politics is to find a kind of an institutional arrangement that would take people as they are, bad people as they are bad, and find institutions that will force bad people to behave in pro-social ways. Again, there's this big difference between Plato and Aristotle. Leo Strauss is going to, the this is one of his main theses, that sort of modern political philosophy sort of throws its hands up in the air before the problem of virtue. That, modern political philosophy has given up on trying to make people virtuous. And I think Strauss sort of wants to go back to the ancient Greeks and thinks that, maybe we can still try to make people virtuous even in the 20th or 21st century, but, that's neither here nor there. So again, under ideal circumstances, for both Plato and Aristotle, the expression of highest virtue is dependent, or highest excellence of human beings is dependent on social conditions. And you see, it's like I kept talking about how for Plato, if you are born in a bad polis, you just escape into private life and you just contemplate or think about eternal forms in your own leisure time. But ideally, you would want to be born in a Callipolis. You can really properly be as happy as you can be only in a Callipolis for Plato, in his perfect republic. So even though, again, Plato is anti-political, but still, in this, he agrees with Aristotle that, again, our highest virtue is realizable only in the state. And in this sense, again, this idea of zoon politikon, that human beings properly flourish only in a society. And I suppose the most important outcome of this is that for Aristotle, for Plato as well, in his Republic, right? This is a vision of consensus. So, I kept talking about conflicts versus consensus. So people like Thrasymachus or Callicles, or, people like Karl Marx would, or Nietzsche, would look around and would say that, society corrupts us. Society is sometimes, or often, or always acts against our interests. Society enslaves us, takes advantage of us. But for Plato and Aristotle, again, we're talking about this, idea of consensus or idea of positive freedom. So this is a phrase due to Isaiah Berlin. I'll talk about it a bit later. So Isaiah Berlin introduces this technical distinction between positive and negative freedom, and Aristotle is going to very much be on the side of positive freedom. Again, in an important sense, we're talking about the coincidence of interest between the individual and the society. So the interest of the individual and the interest of society coincide in a well-ordered state. And so it's like, Marx, well, you see, Marx is complicated because Marx is going to say that capitalism is conflictual, but communism is consensual. So when we talk about capitalism, Marx is like Callicles and Thrasymachus. But when we talk about communism, he becomes like Aristotle. I mean, do you see? Do you understand? I mean, I hope this is not such a difficult thought, right? So for Marx operates in two different regimes. By the way, Rousseau also operates in two different regimes. Rousseau is going to distinguish between the evil contract, which is most states. Most states are bad and lawless tyrannies or despotisms, I suppose. And in this sense, again, Rousseau also is going to echo Callicles and Thrasymachus. But in his ideal state, idealized social contract, the true social contract, if you want, akin to Marx's communism, then society is truly consensual and enables us. And so I was talking about Marx. Marx, in a very important, though unpublished, this is the problem with Marx, most of his works are unpublished. In a very important but unpublished work called German Ideology, Marx talks about how in communism there is no difference between altruism and egoism. Marx insists that in communism people will not be asked to sacrifice their own individual private interest. You will never be asked to sacrifice your individual private interest. In fact, the point is exactly the reverse, that the social arrangement is such that there's a perfect alignment, a perfect coincidence between your interest and the interest of your society. Egoism and altruism point exactly in the same direction. And so, in general, this is the meaning of the phrase zoon politikon. Man is by nature a political animal. We can only be properly human, and we can only be truly free and happy only in a well-constituted society. And again, this is an idea that goes back to Aristotle, and we will see it again in Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx, and especially in Hegel. Hegel, like Aristotle, because you see, Rousseau and Marx have these revolutionary elements, but Hegel shares this conservative outlook with Aristotle. In fact, so much so that I think it's quite appropriate to talk about Hegel as a neo-Aristotelian. When we'll get to Hegel, I'll repeat this. I'll repeat this phrase. And actually, I have this on the slide, this last point. about this class. This is always a strange example to give, and it's kind of awkward a little bit, but still, I think it's illustrative. So let's talk about this. So you see, what is this class? I mean, this class, Introduction to Social and Political Philosophy, in the Department of International Relations in 2020, right? So you could say, of course, you could be cynical about this, and you could say, well, we live in this evil contract, and where the word justice is a lie, propagated by the ruling class in their own interest, right? And you could say that you are forced to take this class, forced, by your parents or forced by the social system, and in fact you are suffering, and I am an evil teacher who tries to indoctrinate you into certain positions or just makes you suffer for some other reason, right? So this would be one cynical and quite unfortunate view, and you could also say that sort of I have to teach this course because if I don't teach this course, I don't know, I run out of money and I die from starvation or something like that. If this was true, this would be a very bleak picture, and it would break my heart. Now, I don't expect you to take this as a knockdown argument against this view, but sort of I really, really hope that that's not the case. Now, let's try to draw an Aristotelian picture of this course. The Aristotelian picture of this course is that, no, actually, your interests coincide with my interests. You want to learn. You want to develop yourself as an individual. Think back to this, how Plato begins his Republic, right? So you have Cephalus, Polemarchus, and you have Thrasymachus. And Cephalus says, I want to obey tradition. And Socrates asks him, but is tradition always good? Do you know that tradition is always good? And the same question you can pose and I can pose, right? So should you and me, should we just blindly follow tradition? It seems Socrates, refutes Cephalus. And Socrates tells Cephalus and us why we cannot blindly follow tradition. So we need to find this knowledge. So you need to take this class, and I need to take this class. Polemarchus says, justice is harming your enemies and helping your friends. But Socrates asks, how do you know who are your friends and who are your enemies? So Socrates says, you have to take this class, and I have to take this class to try to find out who are our friends and who are our enemies, right? Again, Thrasymachus says, justice is the interest of the stronger. But do the stronger sometimes make mistakes? Do the rulers sometimes make mistakes? Do they know what is really good? Again, Callicles says that the best life is the life of unbridled hedonism, trying to have as many desires and as extravagant desires as possible and trying to satisfy them. But is this right? Let's put a question mark. Is this really going to make us happy? Again, let's ask this as a theoretical question, theoretical in the sense of, a question a question to be investigated. Isn't it a bit too dangerous to jump to Calliclean conclusions? Maybe we should first try to investigate, because who knows? You wake up in the morning and you ask yourself, what should I do with my life? And one possibility is maybe you should try to enlarge your desires. But that's a pretty hefty decision, right? It is a decision that if you make this kind of decision in life, it's going to have consequences. So before you make decision, maybe it's a good idea to pause and wait and think, right? And the contention is that the thinkers that we study in this course, throughout these 14 lectures, that every one of these thinkers has something interesting and important and informative to say about that. And so by reading these philosophers and thinking about them, we can actually make our life better. Again, this idea that philosophy should be to the soul what medicine is to the body. And maybe ultimately you will disagree with their answers, or maybe ultimately you will find some other philosophers outside of this course who are saying something. But even if you disagree with what Plato and Aristotle says, clearly this will enlarge your horizon, enrich your understanding. So again, this is slightly long-winded, but I mean this point very seriously. Again, let's use this course as an example of what Aristotle is trying to say. So on this charitable Aristotelian interpretation, this class enables your freedom, enables your happiness, and also enables my freedom and my happiness. And notice, this is not a situation of conflict. Our interests align. And you see, it's like the more you study, the better you try to understand the course, the more you gain from it. And likewise, the more you study, the more I gain from it, right? So I listen to your presentations. The better are your presentations or in general contributions during class. This enriches my understanding. And the better my understanding, the more I enrich your understanding. This is a deeply collaborative enterprise, a deeply collaborative enterprise. And again, so Plato would insist, and Aristotle as well, both of them would insist that sort of primacy of knowledge, of primacy of philosophy in life, right? That the most important, I don't know, the most important thing you can do in life is know. The most important question in life is knowing what to do. And again, it's a question of knowledge. It's a question of investigation. And investigation is necessarily, again, public and social. Not to mention that, again, human capacity for reason and human capacity for speech is inherently social. If we were, imagine this Calclean world of people constantly fighting against one another, of this conflictual world, we would not be able to have speech. We would not be able to have dialogue. We would not be able to have science. Science, again, is deeply and intrinsically collaborative. And that's the vision, and this is something for us to keep in mind. And so Rousseau is going to talk about this in terms of his true social contract. Hegel is going to talk about this in terms of the Rechtsstaat, and Marx is going to talk about this in terms of communism. Again, a society in which people do things together, enabling each other's freedom. Now, very importantly, I should mention that, of course, it's very important to contrast real world versus ideal model. So when, let's say, Rousseau is going, or Plato or Aristotle are going to talk about patriotism, they're talking about patriotism vis-a-vis a properly constituted society. We're not talking about any society anywhere and everywhere. You can imagine horrible exploitative regimes in which people are being taken advantage of, or in which people are, being maybe murdered or raped or enslaved. So it's like we are, in Aristotle or Plato, we are talking about, or Rousseau, we are talking about value of patriotism, but patriotism vis-a-vis, right, with respect to a properly constituted society. So this is an important point to be kept in mind. So, it's like there's this temptation to say, oh, Plato is a totalitarian. Well, and I think the strict answer is no, he is not, because you could say he's unrealistic, you could say he's utopian or idealistic, but he's not totalitarian because, again, the express purpose of his city is to make its citizens happy and virtuous, right? And this is something very important to keep in mind. So Let me talk about this. So in an important sense, I think that we can agree with this idea that we are all, well, I don't want to say we're all Aristotelians, but we're all Aristotelians with a question mark. Because, you see, again, within the history of philosophy, we can see different kinds of ideals, right? And so Socrates or Diogenes is going to talk about this extreme asceticism. Again, Socrates, especially in the early dialogues, or Socrates, the way he lived his life. Again, this idea that he is not rich, who has much, but he is rich, who needs little, right? And this idea that you're going to have as little possessions as possible, you're going to rely as little as possible on possessions or, wealth or things that you have to depend on for other, on things that you have depend for on other people or in general on social arrangements or luck, right? Again, so this idea of Diogenes that you can be happy basically in any situation. Ultimately, the extreme position would be that sort of even if you are tortured, Socrates would say, through the strength of your mental constitution, through the strength of your self-control, you can be happy even while you're being tortured. This is this extreme ascetic position, and there's something to be said about this. We'll talk about this next time again. It's a very famous exchange between Diogenes, according to the legend, exchange between Diogenes and Alexander the Great. How Alexander the Great meets Diogenes, maybe in the streets of Corinth. And Diogenes is living like a hobo just in the street in this barrel. And Alexander the Great, comes curious and to see him and asks him, Diogenes, what can I do for you? And in an important sense, Diogenes tells him, fuck off, Alexander the Great. You can do nothing for me. Get out of my light, is what he says. Alexander the Great cannot do anything to Diogenes. He cannot do anything good to him, and he also cannot harm him at all. Right? So there's this ideal of self-sufficiency in Diogenes and in Socrates, and this radically independent way of life. But this is extremely radical. Most of you and most of people I know are not going to live these kinds of lives. I've known a bunch of people, in my life, and true, it's true. I have several acquaintances who have, chosen extreme lifestyles. Like I had a friend from a university who went on to Bali to become a yoga teacher. Okay. This looks like what Diogenes or Socrates could do. This ideal of sort of yogic self-sufficiency. Yeah, maybe, but most people are not going to choose this kind of occupation in life. So the other alternative is this religious asceticism, which is different from Socratic or cynical asceticism of Diogenes, right? So religious asceticism within Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, or Buddhist asceticism, for example. But again, the thing is, most people don't live lives like that. And Nietzsche says God is dead, and Weber confirms that God is dead. And the immediate reason is that even the vast majority of people who say that they are Christians do not live according to the Bible. Jesus tells us in the Gospels, if you have possessions, give them all away. Be like the birds of the field. Be like the lilies of the pond. Don't worry about tomorrow. Just, again, this extreme ascetic way of life, just relying on God and not even worrying about what kind of bread you're going to get, tomorrow, right? And again, very few people live like that. And this is one of the meanings of Nietzsche's phrase, "God is dead." Because even people who say that they believe in God do not live according to the biblical precepts in this sense, right? And also, of course, again, I talked about Callicles, so we talk about, so extreme hedonism is not necessarily Callicles, maybe, I don't know. But most people are not going to be extreme hedonists, in a sense that it's hard to explain, but it's like, imagine a vision of extreme hedonism, like maybe if you can afford it, okay, you know what, the examples are so gross, I'm not even sure I want to go into these examples. But it's like, in general, and this last point about Machiavellian psychopaths, also, this sounds, I don't want to say strange, but unattractive. Most people do not want to live like psychopaths. Machiavellian psychopaths just taking advantage of others. This story of the ring of Gyges, right? That you get the ring of invisibility, go around raping, stealing, and murdering. It seems that most people would be uncomfortable with that. Again, when I say it seems, of course, this is a controversial position, but sort of the idea is that most people, one way or another, and well, it's like my psychologist friends tell me that there's research to back this up. People would be uncomfortable with doing something like that. So what are we, if not all of these things? Well, Aristotle's idea is that, again, what is real is rational, what is rational is real, right? So he wants to take a look at the way people live, actually live in the polis. And he wants to say that sort of all of our emotions and all of our capacities, we have to exercise in the proper respect. Well, as a matter of fact, Aristotle is also going to talk about the parts of the soul. And for him, the parts of the soul would be vegetative, appetitive, and rational parts of the soul. So vegetative is the one that's responsible for nutrition and growth. And this is the parts of the soul that only plants, animals, and people have. But it's, so it's plants have only this part of the soul. So appetitive parts of the soul is animals. So vegetative is plants, animals, and people. Appetitive is animals and people, and rational part of the soul is only human beings, only humans. And so Aristotle wants to say that in an important respect, we have to satisfy all three parts of our soul. But ultimately, at the end of the day, and this is kind of this is a strange argument that most people will not find plausible today. But Aristotle would say that since we have our unique function, which is related to reason or rationality, then to be properly human is to first and foremost exercise this function. And in general, so when he says rationality, he means intellectual rationality, like thinking, about mathematics or doing philosophy, contemplation, the word that Aristotle would use, but also practical rationality, and this would mean engaging in politics, but also engaging in family life. So again, the reason I said that we're all Aristotelians is because Aristotle, again, has this very, not sure what's the right phrase, very conservative vision of human happiness. He says that a happy person needs to have a moderate amount of wealth, at least, maybe more, but at least a moderate amount of wealth. You also need to be moderately healthy. So there's a great deal of luck whether you will be happy or not, right? So you need to be born moderately happy. And again, somebody like Socrates or Diogenes would say, well, it's not important. Even if you are unhealthy, you should train your soul to disregard the pains of your disease. For Aristotle, no. Again, so you need to have maybe let me add this somewhere. So you need to have health, wealth. You need to have family. You need to be born in a good family, and you also need to create your own family. So you need to have a spouse, a wife, and you need to be male, which is kind of problematic from our 20th century standpoint. And this is actually, well, I'm going to talk about slaves and women in a second. This is obviously a deeply problematic part of Plato's philosophy. I'm going to talk about this in a second. So you need to have, so I suppose, let me again. So yeah. Spoiler alert, trigger warning. Unfortunately, Aristotle is a sexist, unlike Plato. Plato believes that in general, there should be equality of opportunity, and we're going to see, we're going to allow women to compete on par with men. Aristotle is not like that. Aristotle has his prejudice. He thinks that women are inferior. And his reasons for that are precisely conservative, because again, Plato closes his eyes as a mathematician, and he says, I don't see anything in the idea of a woman which makes a woman inferior to men. But this is Plato. But Aristotle looks at existing cities, and all the cities that he can see around, in all of the cities that he knows, women are subordinate. They're kept in the household. And so again, this phrase, was vernünftig ist, das ist wirklich, right? What is rational is real, what is real is rational. Aristotle's conservatism, right, is trying to find reasons. So whatever he sees around himself, Aristotle is trying to find reasons for. So if his culture is sexist, he's going to try to find ways to rationalize that. If his culture is racist, as Greek culture was, and thought that Greeks are higher than barbarians, he's going to try to find a rational justification for that. If his culture is slave-owning, Aristotle is going to try to find reasons to justify slavery and say that slaves have to be inferior by nature or something like that, right? Anyway, so you need to have health, wealth, family, wife, children, very importantly, and you need to live a long life, die of old age, and also you need to have leisure, and so free time, and this means that you need to have slaves. So and you need to be a member of a polis. So you need to be able to engage in politics. Again, this taking turns, ruling and being ruled, and so it's like, this is very different from Plato, because Plato would say that sort of ultimately at the end of the day, you can just be happy. It seems, in some of the dialogues, Socrates puts forth this position that what makes you happy is contemplation of these perfect forms. Contemplating, thinking about, if you want, the form of the good or the form of beauty itself. This is what makes you happy. And this is enough for happiness. For Aristotle, it seems not so. You need to have all of these things. And in addition to all this, you also need to do philosophy. Yes, philosophy is part of that, the joys of philosophy. But Aristotle would say that, you see, human beings are not gods. Aristotle's ideas of gods is that gods engage in the perfect, most self-sufficient activity, which is contemplation or thinking. He says that divine intelligence, and probably Aristotle, as a polytheists believe that there were many gods. Maybe in one of his treatises he says maybe 56 gods for astronomical reasons. He postulates, and sort of these divinities think about themselves. So it's the divine intelligence is a thought thinking itself, a kind of maybe meditation. But Aristotle is going to say, if humans were gods, this is what we would do. But we are not gods, so we can engage in philosophy some of the time, and a perfectly happy human life would be sort of would incorporate that, would include that. But we cannot engage in philosophy all the time, right? And in some sense, that's the basic idea. And Aristotle also has this phrase. He talks about how outside the polis, man can only be a beast or a god. So outside the polis, a man can only be a beast, subhuman, or a god, superhuman. And it's also kind of interesting because you could say, well, but this again, this contrast between nature and convention for the sophists, and again, you see, it's kind of interesting because sophists, especially if you compare them to Aristotle, seem to be much more progressive. Sophists would be willing to question the naturalness of slavery. But Aristotle, in his conservative fashion, would say, no, slavery actually exists, therefore we have to assume that slavery has some kind of rational component. And again, Aristotle's explanation of slavery is very simple. He wants to say that human beings, in order to engage in politics and in order to engage in philosophy, need to have leisure. And in order to have free time, therefore, you need other people to work for you. And so nature, by nature, this world, which is rational for Aristotle, will provide people who are born with inferior natures, who are born subhuman, right? And this is kind of a problematic argument in all sorts of ways. And this has been used as an attempt to justify slavery for since forever, basically, like for all eternity. And this is in some sense deeply sinister and ideological. But what Aristotle is saying is kind of it's unseemly, right? Most people will find this deeply offensive, right? What he says is that some people are slaves by nature. But on the other hand, you have to see that his justification is that the only people who are fit to be slaves, have to be demonstrably irrational, demonstrably incapable of ruling themselves. And this is kind of an interesting argument because actually, if you look at the text of Aristotle's Politics, you can try to use Aristotle's Politics as an argument against slavery. Because again, it's like Aristotle thinks about, in this vision of harmony, vision of consensus, and so even the slaves have to benefit from the system. And his justification for slavery is that slaves, because they are incapable, they are subhuman, irrational, they are incapable of governing themselves, therefore they need a benevolent master who will rule over them for their own good, right? So his justification of slavery is that slavery has to be, is applicable only to people who are irrational, and slavery has to be for the good of the slaves, for the benefit of the slaves. And he even talks about how, under ideal circumstances, slaves should be friends with their masters. And so in this sense, if you actually then do a study, some kind of, imagine some kind of a social experiment, like you take people whom you supposed were slaves by nature and give them conditions that would allow them to express their rich and varied abilities, and you would find that they are actually as rational as everybody else, then suddenly you can turn Aristotle's idea on its head. And Klosko actually says that basically basically Aristotle's justification of slavery can only be applied today to people who are, let's say, mentally handicapped, like mentally ill, or maybe to some limited extent to children, if we consider children, at a certain age to not be fully rational. But then again, are children slaves of their parents? Well, we don't tend to see it that way. But you have to remember, again, Aristotle says, again, in this consensual fashion, that slavery has to be for the benefit of the slaves. So in this sense, again, parents rule despotically over children. They have the power to decide, but for the benefit of the children. So this is kind of, consensual view. Okay. So yeah, so I was talking about this phrase. Yes. So outside the polis, you can only be subhuman, a beast, or a god, which is superhuman. But the problem is that we are not gods. We are not gods. And well, again, it's like in later medieval philosophy, theologians would ask, can saints be superhuman outside the polis, living in, let's say, like hermits alone in the desert? But barring bracketing out these extreme interpretations, we would have to say that, again, for Aristotle, again, you can be properly human and properly happy only within a well-constituted society, a well-constituted polis. Again, and just as a contrast, this is different for Plato, who thinks that outside the Callipolis, if you're not born in a perfect city, the Republic, politics is bad, and you should resort to private virtue and just not engage in politics. Okay. So I don't know. I'm going to have to talk about this word teleology, which is a very important word for Aristotle. This idea of telos, that there are, again, you see, like this in this fresco by Raphael, Plato pointing to the sky and Aristotle pointing down to earth is not exactly accurate, because again, Aristotle, with Plato, believes that this world is inherently rational, that there are objective moral standards embedded in this world, and this world is ultimately good, right? It's like Aristotle, well, he has complicated theology, but there is something like divine intelligence, something like providence governing this world. So this world is good. And everything in this world has a proper function. Nature does nothing in vain. And there is a certain understanding of human nature and what really makes us happy, and we talked about this. And I have this phrase, "rose in full bloom," right? So this is this idea that human beings fulfill themselves, in cooperation with others, developing their rich and varied abilities. This is the vision of human life. And actually, so this one interesting word, important word, eudaimonia, which literally means good spirit or something like that. And this is the word for happiness, which Aristotle uses. And it's kind of interesting because happiness is for human beings is like this excellent exercise of reason, or maybe habit of exercising your reason excellently, something like that. And I'm going to talk about this. Not sure if I should talk about this now, but again, this idea of habit is crucially important for Aristotle. The idea being, again, that a good person is the one who habitually behaves in a proper manner, in a good manner, who doesn't need to decide what to do in this or that circumstance, but who habitually chooses to do the right thing. Doesn't like if you have an opportunity to steal, you don't think to yourself, should I steal or should I not steal? And then you make the decision, no, I will not steal. No. This is bad for Aristotle. You should automatically, immediately, habitually decide to not steal. Again, this important role, political role of habit, we will explore later in the course. So habit. Let me mention this. Okay. So I wonder. Well, okay. Let's talk some more about Aristotle's politics. So again, I talked about this political skill. So Plato, he has this vision of technical expertise, that the rulers in the Republic have this knowledge of perfect forms, and this allows them to govern well. And you can imagine that if political knowledge is akin to mathematics, you can and do have brilliant young mathematical geniuses, right? So it seems that in principle you can have a young expert politician for Plato. Not so for Aristotle. Aristotle says that what is required for politics is not this technical knowledge of the forms, right? But practical wisdom. The Greek word is phronesis or phronesis, practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is acquired through years of experience. So you talk about this old savvy politician. In fact, there is this English word, important word, savvy, which is one translation of this idea of practical wisdom or phronesis. And basically, what Aristotle is going to say is that different circumstances require different solutions, and these solutions cannot be formalized in a system of straightforward rules like mathematical rules. And so immediately what Aristotle is going to say is that you can have different regimes. And this is a big difference, huge difference between Plato and Aristotle. For Plato, it's either the Callipolis or everything else is bad. And right now I'm talking about Plato in the Republic because it seems that later in life, especially in the dialogue The Laws, Plato's last dialogue, The Laws, seems to bring Plato closer to Aristotle. In fact, I think Klosko writes that maybe Plato has actually changed his views in dialogues with Aristotle, like talking to Aristotle, and Plato moved closer to Aristotelian position towards the end of his life. But again, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm talking about Plato of the Republic. Anyway, so Plato of the Republic seems to say it's either the Callipolis or all politics is bad, and all states are bad beyond redemption. This is not Aristotle. Again, you have to remember, Aristotle is a doctor. When you come to a doctor, you don't expect to hear, "Oh, you're not perfectly healthy, you might as well be dead." Right? This seems to be Platonic revolutionary politics. It's either you're perfectly healthy or you're as good as dead. Doctors are not like that. Doctors have to recognize that all patients, it's like you can make the life of all patients at least slightly better. And so Aristotle is going to say that you can have 6 regimes, or actually more, at least 7, and maybe even more if you include mixed constitutions. But ultimate idea would be that all regimes are at least to some extent good. The worst regime imaginable for Aristotle and for Plato, so for both Plato and Aristotle, the worst regime that you can find yourself in is tyranny. But even the worst tyranny, Aristotle seems to imply, is worth preserving, is better than nothing. Again, remember, outside the polis, outside of society, human beings can only be beasts. Humanly, you can only be a beast. So it is better to be a citizen of a tyranny than to be outside the polis altogether. So this is in this sense, Aristotle should remind us of Hobbes, who talks about how, basically, like, any society is better than no society. Something along those lines. Now, you could immediately retort and say, well, some regimes are like really horrible and exploitative. What do you do if your government sends you off to die in a concentration camp? And this is a difficult question. But you have to remember that both Plato and Aristotle, both Hobbes and Aristotle have not really had experiences with concentration camps. So, would this reasoning apply to a concentration camp? Not clear, maybe not. Let me say probably not, right? But sort of the kinds of tyrannies that Aristotle could observe in his own life. I mean, what would be an example of a tyranny for Aristotle? Well, I'm not sure he would call it that, but Philip of Macedon was, I think, could be characterized by Greek standards as a tyrant. So like, a tyrant is a ruler who rules despotically, by his own decree. And nuances, of course, and I'm sure Aristotle, because he didn't want to get in trouble, would not use Philip as an example, but it's probably an okay example. And so the idea is that tyrannies in the ancient world were not necessarily tyrannical in the modern sense of the word. It just meant they were ruled by an autocrat. They were ruled by, like Persian Empire, from the standpoint of the Greeks, would be a tyranny. But it's not the same thing as a concentration camp. So basically, Aristotle is going to say that some regimes are better, some regimes are worse, but all regimes are worth preserving. And so again, we're going to talk about these 7 regimes, actually, in a second. I'm going to talk about them. And Aristotle is going to give advice to all of these regimes. So Aristotle, in his book, The Politics, even gives advice to tyrannies of how they can preserve, how tyrants can preserve the rule and maybe make their rule slightly better for their subjects as well. And again, you have to see this consensual view of politics, because at the end of the day, Aristotle understands this, and Hobbes is going to repeat this later. Even in a tyranny, the tyrant is interested to some extent in the health of his subjects. Because again, as Hobbes would say, the strength of the ruler is derived from the vigor of the subjects. Like if you are the king and your subjects are wretched and poor and destitute and sort of dying of starvation or something like that, you cannot be a rich king in such a situation. Sort of your wealth is derived from taxes. If your subjects are poor, you're not wealthy. But also your security is derived from the fighting strength of your subjects. And if your subjects, are miserable and dying, they will not be able to defend you from the outside forces. So even in a tyranny, there is a certain coincidence of interest between the rulers and the ruled. Again. So anyway, so the first three regimes are monarchy, aristocracy, and polity. Monarchy is ruled by one, aristocracy is ruled by the few, and polity is ruled by the many. Now, the first three regimes, monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, are regimes where the rulers rule in the interests of all, and they rule according to virtue. So you have a rule of the virtuous citizens. And in fact, theoretically speaking, although I don't think that Aristotle really takes this possibility also seriously, the monarchy, it seems, has the highest potential to be the best regime. If this would be a rule by a single supremely excellent individual, like some kind of a saint or a genius, right? According to well, anyway. Political philosophers from time to time would entertain this possibility. Imagine you had sort of a wonderful philosophical genius. If this person could take the reins of government, wouldn't this person be able to do great things, right? Monarchy is the rule of the supremely virtuous individual. But it's important. It is the rule by the best person in society, who's so good at politics that there is no competition. That you cannot take turns ruling and being ruled, because this person is such an expert that you would just delegate all authority to them, right? So this is monarchy. Aristocracy is again ruled by the best few, and polity is this regime in which the many rule, but again rule in the interest of all. And so these are the three good regimes. Now these good regimes are very, very rare for Aristotle. Aristotle understands that most societies are not like that. So we can sort of forget about the top row. It's there, theoretically speaking, but practically speaking, we're not talking about it. Okay, so tyranny is pretty bad, but tyrannies are also, as far as Aristotle is concerned, tyranny, again, you have to understand, Greek experience is kind of idiosyncratic and different. Tyrannies are fairly rare. So the most numerous regimes, the most common regimes are oligarchies and democracies. And so the bottom three, right? So tyrant rules, first of all, in his interest, or her interest, I suppose, and oligarchs rule in the interest of the few, and democrats rule in the interest of the many. And this is kind of interesting, because Aristotle is going to talk about this problem of rich versus poor. He would say that oligarchy is usually ruled by the rich, and democracy is usually ruled by the poor, because the few are wealthy and the many are usually poor. Not always, but most of the time. And he would talk about how actually, so the oligarchic principle is rule according to wealth, and he says that, strictly speaking, oligarchs are wrong. They are wrong, because what the oligarchs are saying, they are saying, because we are unequal in point of wealth, we should also be unequal in point of political authority. And Aristotle says this is wrong inference, because people, in order to justify political inequality, people should be unequal in the appropriate respect. So he says the only thing that can justify political inequality is virtue or excellence. The only way that it is appropriate for one person to rule another, if the ruler is a more excellent individual, better at ruling, if you want. And oligarchs are not necessarily better, they are just richer. Richer does not mean better at ruling. So he says oligarchs make this mistake. Democracies, on the other hand, have this idea of one person. Well, it's not just one person by one vote, but the most important democratic institution, and we tend to think of democracy in a different fashion. Would Aristotle even call our society democracy? Probably not, because the most democratic institution, at least for the ancient Greeks, is lottery, where everybody has an equal chance of being represented. So, like, imagine the parliament, but the seats in the parliament are distributed by lot, and there's rotation, like the jury trials, right? And Klosko gives this example that if you imagine a minority in society, right, and distribution of sort of seats in the parliament is in accordance with the distribution of different backgrounds and socioeconomic statuses in society. I think if you think about Senate in the United States of America, most of the senators, if not all, but most of them, are, as far as I remember, sociologists should double check me. I think most of the American senators are millionaires, right? If not all. But most of Americans are not millionaires. And so immediately this is like a huge imbalance. And in fact, Aristotle says that election is an oligarchic institution. Because once you allow for election, people who have more money have much more capacity to advertise themselves during an election. They can also, they have the leisure, the rich have the leisure to and the money to employ rhetoricians, to learn how to speak well, this kind of thing. So in an election, the wealthy have a higher chance of winning. Therefore, it is lottery, which is the democratic institution par excellence. And so Aristotle also says that sort of oligarchies are bad because the rich are not necessarily the best rulers, but democracies are also bad because when you talk about this equal participation in terms of lottery, not everybody is sort of this equality of outcome, right? Equality of chances of becoming, a ruler or a politician. This does not necessarily reflect virtue. So both of these regimes are defective. Both of these regimes are defective. So Aristotle is going to say that ideally, you want your society to be ruled by virtuous individuals, by excellent individuals, but by experts in this, not in the Platonic sense, but in the Aristotelean sense, experts in terms of this phronesis or phronesis, practical wisdom, savvy, experienced politicians. But most states are oligarchies or democracies, and they are pretty bad. They're not completely bad. It's like not bad beyond redemption, but they're pretty bad. And so the best achievable regime, the best realistically achievable regime, and this is a huge difference between Plato and Aristotle. You see, for Plato, it's either Callipolis or you might as well be dead. But for Aristotle, again, a person like comes to a doctor, right? And the doctor tries to do something for every individual. So the best achievable regime is what Aristotle calls polity. And this is very confusing because Aristotle uses the word polity twice. So polity, the Greek word is politeia, which also means regime. The title of Plato's Republic is actually politeia. So it's confusing no end. It's the same word that's used in so many different contexts to mean completely different things. So in the first sense, polity or politeia denotes a virtuous democracy. But in the second sense, in a different sense, polity or politeia, again, denotes a middling regime ruled by the middle class. So it is a temperate oligarchy or a temperate democracy, somewhere a mixture between oligarchy and democracy. So Aristotle says that if you want to make a politeia, you can take an extreme democracy where everything is distributed by lot, and also, as in the Athenian state, people were compensated, people were paid for political participation to allow, because again, if you have to work in order to support yourself, you might not necessarily have the leisure time, the leisure, right, to engage in politics. So people would be paid for coming to the picnics, coming to the assembly and participating in politics, right? So it's like you go voting, and as you come to the polling station, you are actually being compensated because you took a day off from your work in order to engage in politics. So this is extreme democracy, right? And Aristotle is saying if we can moderate that, if we can introduce some property qualifications maybe for some positions in society, or likewise, if you take an oligarchy, and if you can add some positions that will be distributed by lot. So it's like, again, a middling regime between oligarchy and aristocracy, oligarchy and democracy would be best of the realistically achievable. Best of the realistically achievable. Okay, and again, rule by middle class. It's a combination of wealth and lottery, allotment. By the way, for those of you who are wondering about this word lottery, actually most countries today do use a form of lottery in some of our political procedures. For example, trial by jury in a court of law. jurors, суд присяжных, jurors are in most places, in most countries, for example in Russia, selected by lot. And I want to draw your attention again that sort of when Aristotle is talking about this questions of wealth and this rich versus poor, right? Because oligarchy is ruled by the rich who are few and democracy is ruled by the poor who are many. This is actually, again, Aristotle being a foreshadower of Marx, talking about the economic basis of political constitutions, how actually it's like what's the right phrase? Like the constitution should be appropriate to the economic base, and in an important respect, sort of if your society is greatly unequal in terms of wealth, democracy would not work, or polity would not work. So it's like economics, in an important respect, determines what kind of a political regime you're going to have. Again, this is an idea that we see in Aristotle, and Marx is going to later come back to this idea. And Klosko also mentions that sort of for Aristotle, the best way to the easiest, the most straightforwardly, again, achievable way to improve political life, again, in this polity, in the second sense of the word, is to increase the middle class. The more equal is the distribution of wealth in society, the more stable is politics. And Klosko gives a reference, again, sociologists will correct us, but Klosko gives a reference that, in fact, if you look in the world today, places which are approximately economically equal tend to be more politically stable, and places in which you have extreme inequalities of wealth tend to be the most politically unstable, right? So again, this economic inequality as a good predictor for political stability. Again, this thought goes back to Aristotle. And also, I wanted to mention, some people may find this interesting. Aristotle also, is kind of, in some sense, the founder of political sociology. You will notice Plato doesn't care about any of these things. But Aristotle does. And you see, it's to a very large extent, it's easy to summarize Plato because he has these straightforward mathematical, quasi-mathematical ideas. And Aristotle is very hard to summarize because Aristotle, again, his method, he and his students collected more than 150 constitutions and tried to summarize them, right? And in fact, Aristotle's writings are like an encyclopedia, and it's very hard to summarize an encyclopedia. I mean, what can you say about an encyclopedia? It starts with A, and then it goes to letter B, right? But among the several interesting sound bites that we can extract from Aristotle, and I've always found this idea very interesting, that sort of he says that the fighting style of your army is going to have an impact on your constitution. That reliance on cavalry and heavy infantry favors the oligarchs. So if your city has to rely on cavalry or heavy infantry for protection, then necessarily the fighters, the warriors, will demand a share in political participation. Again, the ancient Greek heavy infantry, for example, hoplites, the armor actually costs a lot of money, so only relatively wealthy people can afford to be hoplites. So this kind of hoplites, because they defend this heavy infantry, because they defend the polis, in return they will demand political representation and political participation. And likewise, if your fighting style relies on light infantry, which is cheap to equip, or especially navy, right, then your constitution will be democratic. And historically speaking, this is more or less the way it has happened in ancient Greece. So Sparta relied on heavy hoplite infantry, and Sparta, therefore, was a hoplite oligarchy. The people who had the ultimate say in the affairs of Sparta was the assembly of hoplites. And hoplites, again, heavy infantry, they were a minority of citizens in Sparta, so this is properly speaking an oligarchy of these expert, elite heavy infantry soldiers. And in democratic Athens very much relied on its political power on the navy. And to be a rower in the navy, so the people who rowed the triremes, who manned the oars on the triremes, the sailors in the navy can be poor as dirt. The ships were provided by the state. The ships were paid for by the state. And the rowers, basically anybody who wanted could become a rower. And so these rowers, these sailors, then in return demanded political participation, and this was an important factor in Athenian politics. So again, I think it's kind of important. Again, this course is Introduction to Social and Political Philosophy, right? And this is an important element for us, I think, to keep in mind. Also, again, this is a little bit out of order, but let me just mention, Aristotle actually has his three favorite cities, and these would be Carthage, Carthagena, Sparta, and Crete. And the reason why Aristotle actually liked them, because he thought they were moderate, and especially because he valued, again, this the fact that they were stable. Their constitutions were stable over the long term, right? And again, it's very different from Plato, because again, his ideal city is in his mind, closing his eyes. But Aristotle takes his cue from actually existing societies. So I suppose I should mention, at least in one sentence. So Aristotle talks about how you have individuals. Individuals unite into households. Households unite into villages. And villages unite into polis, or polis in the plural, right? And he finds, again, taking this cue from his teleological approach, he would say that we achieve our proper excellence within the polis. It is small. Again, for both Plato and Aristotle, we are talking about a fairly small political unit. And this is kind of interesting, and Klosko stresses this, that this is a world that is disappearing before Aristotle's very own eyes. I mean, Philip of Macedon, and later his son, Alexander the Great, will destroy the independence of the small city-states and will create huge empires. And in these huge empires, these ideas of self-rule would mostly disappear. So, it's kind of something for us to keep in mind, that Aristotle's idea will very soon become anachronistic. So I suppose I should be wrapping this up, because we are rapidly running out of time. So I suppose the last thing I want to say is that, I suppose these two slides. Next time, we are going to talk about the philosophies of the Hellenistic age. And they are going to be, I think in an important respect, profoundly anti-Aristotelian, at least in certain aspects. So the first aspect in which they're going to be profoundly anti-Aristotelian is that, again, after the conquests of Alexander the Great, right, what happens is that Alexander dies without a legitimate heir, right? And so immediately his empire breaks apart, and you have a long and protracted period of wars, horrible wars. It's a period of chaos. And so this idea of political participation, so not just empire, but also the chaos of empires fighting against one another. And so philosophers after Aristotle would go back to this ascetic ideal of Plato or Diogenes, right? Of trying to achieve happiness not within society. Again, so all this Aristotelian stuff about how in order to be happy, you need to have, you need to be born in a city, you need to have a moderate amount of wealth, at least a moderate amount of wealth. You need to have children, you need to have a wife, etc. So all of this will be deeply unrealistic in the Hellenistic age. Like today, you have wife and children. Tomorrow, there's a marauding, rampaging army walking through your city, and you become poor as dirt, or maybe you become killed, right? So these philosophies that we're going to talk about next time, they very much focus back on the individual. Again, and we'll see this anti-political solution to politics, how the world is bad, let us learn to be independent of it. This is going to be an anti-Aristotelian thrust of philosophies that are going to come later on. And even if like later, when Romans are going to conquer the Mediterranean world and are going to re-establish the peace in the Mediterranean, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which is going to come after the Greek wars. In the Roman Empire, again, the individual has very limited capacity to participate in politics. So this trend will continue into the Roman peace. And again, this idea of how happiness is realized in the private sphere, not in the political sphere. And to a very large extent, I think in our contemporary world, we tend to agree with these. We tend to view life, in these terms, in the broadly speaking, if you want, in Hellenistic terms, and not in Aristotelian terms. Because look at us, look at you, look at me. Most of you do not and will not engage in politics firsthand. And for example, I have never engaged in politics firsthand. And sort of this is for us a normal experience of everyday life. Aristotle would find this deeply offensive to human nature. That again, to be properly human, you need to engage in self-government. And again, we'll talk about Marx later on. Marx has this important anarchist element that you need to have the system of local councils so that most of day-to-day affairs are decided by every member of the community in the course of sort of participating in politics in a local council. So communism, definitely for Marx, has this deeply important Aristotelian connotation, going back to this ancient republican tradition, taking turns ruling and being ruled. Again, you and me, we don't take turns ruling and being ruled. We are just being ruled. We are simply being ruled by rational bureaucracy. This is a modern Western bourgeois rational bureaucracy, right? But Aristotle wants to go back to this idea. So anyway, and so next time when we're going to talk about Hellenistic schools, we will see philosophies who speak to us, speak to our world, where you live in a world when you are being ruled, and sort of you find happiness in private life, not in public life, because public life is unavailable to us. This is going to be the first anti-Aristotelian element in the philosophies that we're going to talk about next time. And the second anti-Aristotelian element is going to be, again, this idea of teleological versus mechanistic worldview. Again, Aristotle has this deeply consensual view of nature, that nature is deeply rational. Nature does nothing in vain. Everything that exists for a reason, and everything is good. Slavery is functional, subordination of women is functional. This world is deeply rational. And even tyrannies, yes, they could be improved, but in general, they are sort of on the whole good. They are, to some extent bad, you could say, but on the whole, they are good, because everything in this world is good. This world is good, right? But especially some of the philosophies we're going to talk about next time, first and foremost the Epicureans, the ancient materialists, they are going, again, to use this Kantian phrase, to talk about this abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter, in which it's not that nature does nothing in vain, no, but in fact our world is a product of chance. And in fact, again, when we move over to the next historical epoch, when we talk about modern philosophy, we're going to begin with Machiavelli and Hobbes. Machiavelli and Hobbes are going to share both of these two anti-Aristotelian stances. Again, for Machiavelli and Hobbes, happiness is constituted by private life, not engaging in politics. In fact, Machiavelli says you have to be a madman to want to be a politician, because the life of politics is extremely hard. It's dangerous, it's tough, it requires you to do terrible things and to put yourself at great risk, right? So for both Machiavelli and Hobbes, happiness in private, not in public life. And secondly, for both Machiavelli and Hobbes, this anti-teleological bent, that no, this world is not our home. This world is not rational. In fact, this world is random, it is cruel, it is unfair, it is conflictual. Again, ultimately for both Machiavelli and Hobbes, it is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. And if humans create a functioning society, it is only through constantly battling against the forces of chaos. There is nothing natural about a good society. Again, if you think about this in terms of Hobbes, Hobbes talks about how the state of nature is the war of all against all. By nature, human life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And again, sort of with this contrast, I'm sure there's a million things I forgot to mention. Hopefully I'll come back to them in the seminars. But in this contrast, and keeping in mind these two anti-Aristotelian thoughts that we're going to come back to in later classes, I suppose I'm going to finish the lecture. So again, let me just note in one sentence, Greeks are hard, so I don't expect you to understand or to remember everything I've said today. The most important idea, again, from Aristotle is this notion of, again, man as a political animal, of this positive freedom, of how human beings are truly enabled by society. Now, this is his lens. You can agree or disagree with Aristotle, but it's an important perspective to keep in mind. And for example, when Hobbes is going to criticize Aristotle, you're going to understand what Hobbes is actually criticizing, right? So, and again, I just remind you that Greek philosophy is not rocket science. Greek philosophy is harder than rocket science. So, but on the other hand, I think chapter on Klosko is very lucid, very lucid. So, you know, you'll have a chance to talk about that. As a postscriptum, I am tempted to mention, you will also find how when Aristotle is writing about Plato, Klosko will point our attention to the fact that Aristotle deeply misrepresents Plato. And it seems that maybe Aristotle doesn't really have the text of Plato in front of his eyes. So, you know, talk about complications, right? So it's like, if you don't understand Plato, well, it seems Aristotle was also not very strong in terms of understanding Plato. Anyway, colleagues, this has clearly gone on for too long. So thank you so much for bearing with me. Again, I hope this was useful. I hope this was stimulating. Thank you so much. Let's keep in touch. I'll be in Teams in case you have any questions in a second. Otherwise, thank you so much. And I will see you in the seminars. And next time, we will move beyond the conquest of Alexander the Great to talk about the Hellenistic schools, to try to take, you know, virtue back from the public sphere into the private, into the sphere of the private. Okay, and that's it. And of course, most importantly,